Welcome back. So you've installed Reaper, you've installed SWS, you've installed the ReaTooled configuration. And by the way, I think I'm going to start calling it ReaTooled instead of ReaTooled. I think that there's some disagreement even amongst people who have used Reaper for a long time. Like, how do you pronounce the equalizer in Reaper is called ReaEQ. And do you say ReaEQ or do you say ReEQ? And anyway, like Reaper ReaTooled, that's the joke, right? So I'll just call it Reaper ReaTooled, even though it's spelled, you get it. So anyway, you've installed it, and what I'd like to do today is just give you kind of a broad overview of the program, kind of an orientation, and just like point out what the different parts of the program are. So up here in the corner, you have the transport, and the transport is the play, stop, pause, record, and then this button here takes you to the beginning of the project. If I had anything out on the arrangement, this would take me to the end of the arrangement. This is the loop button, so I can make a time selection and loop it if I wanted to, or I can turn that loop off. But anyway, this whole thing is called the transport, and that's true of a lot of different DAWs. We just call that area the transport. And next to the transport is the clock. And this is one of the areas where ReaTooled starts to differ from the default Reaper installation. I've made the clock only focus on hours, minutes, seconds, frames, instead of measures and beats. I think this is true in a lot of DAWs, is that they sort of prioritize measures and beats. And in Reaper, you can customize it to just focus on time. So if you want to change any of those settings, you can right-click on them. And this is actually kind of your first Reaper lesson. If you're just a beginner, you can right-click on anything in Reaper, almost anything, and it will give you more options. So whether that's the clock up here or maybe the ruler down here, I can go and customize that in all sorts of ways. And I can set it to measures and beats if I want to, or I can set it to hours, minutes, and frames, or I can even set up a secondary time unit if I want to have both of them. So in Reaper ReaTooled, I've just focused on time because I think that's the thing that's more practical for podcasting, which is what I do. But if you are a musician and you want to use beats and measures, that's how you change it. Okay. So up here, we have the selection section, which tells us, like if I make a time selection by dragging on the ruler here, you can see actually this little pop-up. It says start, end, and length right next to my mouse. And that same information is up here. So this is the start of the selection, the time where the selection ends, and the duration of that selection. So that's just kind of a handy thing to have if you need to sort of measure how long a section of your project is. Next to that is the time signature, which is by default set up for 4/4, and then the metronome, which is set to 120 beats per minute. By default, I've turned off the metronome. We're going to talk more about this section later. But if you are a musician, these things are going to be relevant to you. If you're a podcaster, probably not so much. I'm going to skip over this, but this is the global automation. And then this right here is the rate. So if you wanted to slow down Reaper and hear something, more slowly, or if you wanted to speed it up, and play it at double speed. Sometimes when I'm editing, I listen to my raw tape at double speed just as a way of making my initial selects. So that's how you can turn that on and off. And then if you double click it, you can reset it back to normal. For this next stage, I'm going to actually load a project because it'll be helpful to actually see some audio. So here is just a very quick demonstration. This is from an old episode of Love and Radio called The Living Room, and it's just like the first chapter to that story. So now we can kind of get a better picture of what Reaper looks like when there's a project loaded. And up here, we have something called the Navigator. And the Navigator is basically like a map for the whole project. And if I want to, I can kind of mouse around the Navigator and you can see how that changes what I'm looking at here. So this Navigator is a map, and actually if you hold down Shift and drag, you can focus on different parts of the project that way. So it's kind of like also a way of zooming. You'll also notice that I can customize the placement of all of these things too. So I can make them larger or smaller, get them out of the way. And that's true of basically every part of Reaper. You can even pop these side panels out. So there are lots of ways you can customize it. Now, what's next? Okay, so this is the Navigator. And then below this main area, we call this the Arrange view. And this is where you start to arrange your project. So this is the Arrange here. On the side here, we have the track control panels, which this is where we can mute tracks or solo tracks, and also see what kind of plugins are installed on the tracks if you have any plugins installed. And then on the side here, you have the track manager. And this is something that I've added in the default screen set in ReaTooled. And I've tried to make it basically mirror the way that Pro Tools works. So if I wanted to hide tracks, I can click this little dot and hide tracks, can bring them back. And that way you can decide what you want to focus on in the Arrange view. Below that is the group manager that's down here. I'm not going to talk about that yet. That's a more advanced thing, and we'll save that for way down the line. On the side here, we have the media bay, the project media effects bay is what it's called. And there are a bunch of tabs here, but by default, I have it set to the second tab, which is called media items. And basically this is a list of every clip of sound that I have in the project, every item. And by the way, in Reaper, we call one of these little blocks, we call them items. In Pro Tools, you might call them clips, or you used to call them regions. Regions are actually a different thing in Reaper. So sometimes I'll slip and start calling these things regions or clips because that was how I learned. But they're called items in Reaper. And that's actually really important because I find that learning Reaper and learning really any program, it's sort of like learning a new language, right? And as you start to understand that language, you can start to communicate more effectively in it. But Reaper in particular has a very consistent and logical language. And once you learn how to use it, it opens up the program in some cool ways. So just as an example, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but when you start getting into something called the action list, which is basically a list of all the different things that Reaper can do, and you can do, you can kind of search for functions that have to do with items. So up here in the filter, I've just written the word item. And if I wanted to focus on commands that involve moving an item, then it'll only give me those commands that are relevant to that. So anyway, we'll talk more about that later. I had been talking about the project media and effects bay, and this is a list of all the different clips of sound in, or items of sound in Reaper. If you are used to Pro Tools, this is sort of like the clips list. I actually think it's a lot more powerful than the clips list in a lot of ways, but we'll talk more about how to use it. Similarly, up here where there's a filter, you can narrow down the list to only show you clips that have a certain word. So if I search for story, it's only giving me clips with the word story. Or if I search for extras, it'll narrow down the list to only items that have the word extras in it. So that can be really useful. Okay, lastly, we have the main toolbar, which is right up here. And the main toolbar has a bunch of buttons. And this is pretty similar to the default Reaper configuration, although I've added 4 things up here. But let's just go through it really quickly, and then in later videos, I'll talk about some of this in more detail. But up here you have new project. So you click that to make a new project. And you notice if I mouse over it and hold my mouse, I get a little highlight, a little note saying new project. This one opens a project. This one saves a project. This one opens project settings, which I'll talk about more later. This is the undo button. This is the redo button. This is the metronome if you wanted to add the metronome there. I'm going to skip down here. This is the auto crossfade, which we'll talk about more when we get into some of the nuances of editing. But basically, I recommend keeping this on the whole time. This basically makes it so if you take two items and push one into the other, like so, you get an automatic crossfade there. And that can be a really, see, like right here, this is actually kind of an error where like this crossfade should be a little bit more polished. So what I can do is push it in and then make an automatic crossfade, and then I'll avoid any potential like clicks. So that's a really handy thing to have, and I would just recommend keeping that on the whole time. Next to that is item grouping. If you grouped a selection of items, which we'll do a separate video about that, I can move a group together, or I can turn it off. And so even though they are a group, you can see they have these little chain icons. With the group button turned off, they no longer function as a group. So I recommend keeping that on for the most part. This button indicates ripple, which is sort of like Pro Tools slip and shuffle, but it works a little bit differently, and actually I think is a lot cooler for a bunch of reasons, which we'll make another video about. Next to that, this is move envelope points with media items. This is sort of like automation follows edit, or envelope follows edit in Pro Tools. I recommend keeping this on basically at all times, unless you know what you're doing, and turn it off just for the moments you need it off, and then turn it right back on. Otherwise, your project can get messed up in a bunch of different ways. We'll make a video on that. Next, we have the grid, and this is more handy if you're doing music and you want like a grid to show the measures and beats. So I have that turned off by default in ReaTooled. Next to that is the snap, and this makes it so if you push different items next to one another, and I'm just going to turn off these fades for a minute. If you push items next to another, they kind of snap as they get close to each other. And this is a way of making sure that your edits are, that there's no gap between them. I basically recommend having this on the whole time, but some people might find that annoying. And then if you do find the snap annoying for whatever reason, you can turn it off, but I recommend that you keep it on basically the whole time. And if you want to customize the way it works, you can right click on it and then get a whole bunch of preferences. This is the lock, which if you wanted to lock down your project for whatever reason, so if you shared it with someone and they can't move things around, you could do that. And if you right click on it, you can get a checklist of all the different things that you can lock in Reaper. But by default, I'm just going to keep that off. Now we have these four that I've added. And this one on top is render, render project to disk. This is like bouncing your project, basically exporting it as a WAV or an MP3. And if you click that, you'll get the render dialog box. And we'll talk more about rendering later. I'm not going to render now. Down here is the color swatch. This is a script that someone wrote for Reaper that I've added as a default in Reaper ReaTooled. And this is how you can color tracks, like so, or items like so. And up here we have the master fader. So sometimes it's nice to be able to see the levels of what is going out on Reaper. So this is basically my master fader and all the plugins that are on my master channel. And I can also show that in the mixer with command equals. If I turn it off here, it disappears from the side. And now the master fader is a part of the mixer. So I can basically toggle where I want the master to be. Do I want it to be on the side of the program? Do I want it to be part of the mixer? And that's kind of up to you. And then lastly down here, this is the notepad. And it's possible to leave notes on all different parts of Reaper. So you can leave notes on items, you can leave notes on tracks, you can leave notes on the project. And so you can kind of go through this, and if you wanted to like collaborate with someone and say like, I think this section should go. Now up here, I have a little note icon. And so if I click that, the note pops up. So You have a note pop up here, and you can also see it right down here. That's what the notes panel is. One last thing before we go is to talk about the menu bar up here. And you probably know the menu bar. It's file and edit. File is all the things that you would do sort of for the whole project. Edit is copy and paste and all that kind of thing. But view lets us hide different parts of Reaper. So if I wanted to really customize the way Reaper looks, I could like hide the transport. I could hide the project media effects bay on the side there. I can hide the track manager. I can hide the group manager. I can hide the navigator. And so you can see I'm creating a layout that is a little bit more clean. And so some of you might prefer this, especially if you have like a smaller screen on your computer. But by default, I have all these things turned on in Reaper because I want it to be familiar to people who are coming from a Pro Tools background. So I've set it up here to look more like what you'd expect if you are familiar with Pro Tools. All right, so that's view. Next is insert. This is if you wanted to add anything to Reaper. Now you can always drag and drop files directly into the Reaper application, but if you wanted to, this is another way. You can add markers, you can add regions, which is basically, in Reaper speak, a region is like a marker, but over time. We can make a video about that at some point. Next to insert is item, and so this is a menu bar for all the things that you can do to a clip of sound, an item here. So you can group them, you can remove them, you can split them, you can glue them together and sort of make new files that way. So anything that you would potentially do to an item, you can do up here in the item menu bar. Then similarly, track is all of the functions that you would do to a track. You can insert a new track, you can insert a virtual instrument, you can duplicate tracks, and you can do a lot of this stuff also by right-clicking on the track too. Again, if you right-click on anything, it gives you more options. So know that this is one way that you can modify tracks. You can also right-click. Next to track is options. And I won't go into too much detail on the options right now. This is another thing that I've customized specifically for ReaTooled, and I would just recommend for now keeping all the options set as they are. But if you want to customize the performance of Reaper, this is one of the ways you can do it. Next to that is actions, and this is a way to basically pull up all the different types of commands that you can do in Reaper. And Reaper has this really cool thing called the action list, which we should make a whole video about the action list. But it's basically a list of every possible thing that Reaper can do in the whole program and its corresponding shortcut. So you can also search for that by searching for like fade. If I wanted to search for fade, it'll narrow this list down to only actions that have to do with fades. And then similarly, I can also do like a reverse search. I can do find shortcut, and then I can type a key, like I'll type F, and then it will show me here that the F key makes a crossfade between items. Okay. So the action list is super powerful. It also lets you combine these different actions in different ways as you get more advanced. So you can kind of make macros, basically commands that are compound actions. So that can be really cool. And that's part of also how I've customized Reaper for you. But that is the actions menu. And then this is just sort of a list of like recent actions or custom actions that I've built. But you can look at that in more detail if you'd like. Next to that is extensions. And this was the menu bar that the SWS extensions added. And so there are a whole bunch of other more advanced things that you can do here thanks to the SWS extension. And then next to that is window, which is just sort of the layout of Reaper as a program. And then help, which is where you can find documentation, a list of the different key commands. And then lastly, we have this up here, which just shows the audio settings that you're working with. So in this case, this project is set to 48 kilohertz, 24-bit. And I'm using a buffer of 512 samples. This is a little bit more advanced, but when you get into configuring your audio device, you might be interested in some of this stuff. So this is just a quick snapshot of what your audio settings are. Okay, so that was a very broad overview of Reaper and all the different sections. Actually, not all the different sections because there's a lot more, but these are the main sections that you'll see in ReaTooled. And I think moving forward, I'm going to do kind of a mixture of beginner-oriented videos and then also things that cover advanced and intermediate topics for people who have been using Reaper for a longer time. So yeah, drop me a line with any questions that you might have, because that can help guide me towards the subjects that you might be interested in. You can like, comment, and subscribe. I guess that's something I probably should have said earlier in the video, but I'm still getting used to this medium. And I guess that's it for now. So I'll see you on the next one.